I'm Elisa Parenti in Washington, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word news. The Committee on Taxation says the Senate tax bill will add $1 trillion to the federal deficit over a decade. It finds economic growth from the tax cut only will offset $407 billion of the $1.5 trillion total cost. The JCT estimates the Senate bill will increase growth more than other models so far, but the analysis complicates the GOP argument that the overhaul will pay for itself. House Republican leaders plan to seek a 2-week spending bill to fund the government until December 22nd to avoid a government shutdown. Current funding is set to run out on December 8th. The plan hasn't been finalized, according to a GOP House rep and top aides, but it will buy more time for negotiations with Democrats on a longer-term funding plan. And President Trump will deliver his first State of the Union address on January 30th. House Speaker Paul Ryan formally invited the president today. In a letter, Ryan called the address to the joint session an opportunity to lay out the work that remains to be done for the American people. And State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert says Chief of Staff John Kelly has denied reports that the White House is planning to remove Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and replace him with CIA Director Mike Pompeo. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, blank finds Bitcoin waiting game. The Goldman Sachs CEO gives his take on the volume and volatility of the world's most traded cryptocurrency. Plus, the spotlight shines on Google following reports of top-level inter-office affairs. How will big tech respond? And AI at the front lines, how machines have taken the lead in the fight to filter extremist content on social media. But first, to our lead. Technology stocks rebounded in Thursday trading from their worst sell-off in more than a year. While the Nasdaq is recovering from losses, the Dow staged its third triple-digit gain of the week. So in a year where the performance of tech stocks handily beat other sectors, where are we in the market cycle? Gina Martin-Adams, Chief Equity Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, joins us from New York, along with our guest host for the hour, Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick. Gina, I will start with you. So where are we? You said these stocks could be subject to rotation risk toward the end of the year. Is that what we're seeing now?
Well, we saw a little bit of it in the month of November. Tech stocks are actually underperforming the market in the month of November. It's also highly unlikely, given history, that stocks that outperformed in the January to November period continue to outperform all the way through December, because you typically see a little bit of rotation into December and then even into January. So they may face a very near-term headwind. That said, when you look out over 6, 12, 18 months, tech is largely expected to continue to produce relatively robust earnings growth, continuous margin expansion. The fundamentals are still generally there, and there's nothing to suggest in the price trend, even with the modest pullback we had yesterday, there's nothing to suggest in the price trend that there's anything really ominous on the horizon for tech just yet.
David, for the last couple of months, we've been debating whether these issues around fake news and election meddling would impact these platforms when it comes to the markets. We haven't really seen that yet. Do you think there are big risks at play?
I think there are risks, but they're very long term. I don't think there's any impact on the stocks in the short term unless there was a dramatic development that we don't know of now. I do believe, and I've been talking to a lot of people about this recently, that unless the big tech companies, Facebook, Google in particular, take much more concrete efforts than they've taken so far to address fake news and a number of other issues that are causing great concern, their stock will be affected. But this is a long-term thing. It's about social kind of trust and whether that would be impaired. I do think probably they'll take some good gestures over time, but at the moment it's not looking that promising.
So, Gina, how would you differentiate between what we'll see in the short term and what we'll see in the long term?
Well, I think when you're a lot of it depends on what investor you're talking to and what their time horizon is, right? For investors who right now are struggling to catch up with the market trends so far this year, who are looking for opportunities to add to positions in S&P 500 portfolios, they're looking at value stocks, frankly, to give them a little bit of pop into year end. And that makes a lot of sense given what's happening with financials, with regulation, with potential for tax reform, and given what we're seeing in inflation and the 10-year Treasury. But when you're looking over a longer term time period, 12, 14, 18 months, what you see is the earnings growth rates for tech are really tough to ignore. You know, even though valuations are a little bit high, they're nowhere near where they were in the peak in the 1999-2000 bubble in tech. And a lot of people use that as an excuse not to get into tech. Frankly, the fundamentals are much stronger than they were in that period, and we haven't seen any bubble-like behavior start to embed itself in the stock prices. So there's still a longer tail, I think, secular tailwind for the tech sector that you really can't ignore. Just in the short run, it's just extremely likely that the tremendous gains we've had over the year really continue to power this sector into the end of the year.
So, David, you know, with the fundamentals being strong, what signs will you be looking for that some of the risks you're concerned about are actually having an impact?
Well, again, I do think it's long term. We've seen some interesting steps in recent days and weeks from some of the tech giants to address, again, specifically the fake news problem, the risk of terrorist propaganda on their platforms. But I actually think it's really a matter of what Congress decides to do, and that seems to be more or less nothing in any near-term scenario. So, to be honest, I do think we have a big problem for society, but it's not going to be reflected in the stock price, certainly within the next few months. Probably, it could be next year. Ask me again in 6 months.
Gina, say there is regulation. Yeah. Would that have an impact?
Yeah, I think it would, and the reason I say that is because other sectors in the S&P 500, especially financials, which is the second largest sector to tech, has actually a decreasing regulatory pressure, at least from a general investor sentiment perspective. We haven't seen any real decline in regulation for financials, but we've at least seen a decrease in the rate of regulation and maybe even a halt to regulatory pressures. So in that relative comparison, just even the perception that regulation may impact the tech sector does deplete its relative multiple in comparison to financials. That said, I totally agree. It seems highly unlikely that Congress really addresses the issue, that we have actually start to see any true regulatory impact on tech. It's just when you compare to financials, where the regulatory impact is perceived to be diminishing, it is a little bit of a headwind.
All right, Gina Martin-Adams of Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you very much. David Kirkpatrick of Techonomy, you are sticking with me for this hour. Meantime, Bitcoin has had a roller coaster week, soaring to $11,000 before crashing back down to Monday's level. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, and Mike Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, sat down with our very own Alex Steele and talked about if they see value in the cryptocurrency.
It's not for me. But there's a lot of things that weren't for me in the past that worked out very well. If you told me that if it was 20 years forward and it worked out, I could tell you why it worked out. But based on everything I know, I'm not guessing that it will work out. But I can't say, I'm not going to stand there and be strident and say it's a fraud. It can't, because it might.
Alex, I think also people confuse Bitcoin with BitChain. There is a blockchain. There is a technology where you can have different accesses to data. Different people can control it. You can see who's doing what and that sort of thing. And there are places where that is a useful thing. In fact, the Bloomberg system is a blockchain. We just, instead of having the users control it, we control it, but it has all the attributes of that. Bitcoin is something very different. Bitcoin, and there's a whole bunch of cryptocurrencies that have been started every day. You have a new one. That's something very different. And whether or not the governments of the world will lose control of monetary policy, I'm skeptical. They're just not going to let that happen, and they shouldn't.
Something that moves up and down 20% in a day doesn't feel like a current, doesn't feel like a store
and it's
value.
just being quoted up and down. There's no value.
Maybe not a currency, but Jeff Curry told me it was a commodity, and that goes to your expertise, Lloyd. You grew up in the commodity business. So talk to me about what are the unregulated trading world of Bitcoin? Like, where's the fraud going to come?
The whole concept is, I don't, well, first of all.
But is it buyer, is it seller, is it price discovery? Like, where's the risk there in the financial
One of the main uses of Bitcoin is as a vehicle for perpetrating fraud. I mean, because you can't trace it. There's no payment.
So is cash sometimes.
So is cash, but guess what? It's hard to accumulate cash sometimes.
Yeah, but the world is going in a different direction. If you think about it, go look in China where they're basically getting rid of cash. Everybody is paying with their smartphones. People who are begging in the streets have a little sign next to where they're sitting in the streets. These are people who really need help from society. Instead, they're sitting there begging for money. They have a sign with a code on it, a QR code. If you want to give them money,
Really?
you point your cell phone at the QR code, hit a button, and they have a bank account. And that's the way they're getting their money. China is heading in the direction, and they've gone a very large way, as is India starting to do the same thing, of getting rid of cash. And one of the reasons is that you can then stop the black market and stop the drug dealers, and you can track where all the currency is going. We're not going to go in a different direction. Now, America may not be ready to go there, although we're going to be left behind if we don't, because this is a much more efficient ways of paying for goods and services.
So, Lloyd, that's
they're also going to know what everybody's doing with their money.
Of course they're going to know, but Google already knows exactly what you're doing.
And Amazon, by the way.
Complains in Amazon. Nobody complains about that.
But Lloyd, so that raises the question. You have to be thinking about an investment banking strategy with Bitcoin. I can't believe that you're not.
No, I don't have to be thinking about that.
You want to tell me that you're not talking to any of your guys?
What?
You're not talking to your guys about what the strategy is going to be.
But it was spending too. It's just, you know, we'll see. If it works out and it gets more established and it trades like a store of value and it doesn't move up and down 20% and there's liquidity in it, you know, we'll get to it. But you asked me, the original question was, when do small business people have to think about their Bitcoin strategy? I'd worry about opening the doors, producing things that people want to buy, dealing with their, you know, business planning.
Lloyd Blankfein there, CEO of Goldman Sachs, and Mike Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, with our Alex Steele. And a stock we are watching, shares of Dialog Semiconductor fell the most in 8 months. This after a Nikkei article reported Apple is designing its own power management chips to use in the iPhone. UK-based Dialog relies on Apple for about 3/4 of its revenue. Coming up, serious shakeups at NBC could have serious repercussions on ratings. We'll have all the details next. This is Bloomberg. More on a story rocking the media world. The face of NBC's flagship morning show, Matt Lauer, was fired Wednesday for sexual misconduct. The Today Show star's fall comes as NBC is locked in a fierce ratings battle with ABC's Good Morning America. The network was also preparing for the high-profile Winter Olympics in February, when Lauer was likely to anchor much of the network's coverage. Today generated over $500 million in advertising revenue just last year. Joining us now from LA, Bloomberg's Anusha Sakui. So look, new revelations still coming out about Matt Lauer. Anusha, how much will this hurt NBC?
Well, that's really what I suppose most investors in Comcast will be wondering. It had been the Today Show had been a leader in the ratings, but that had started to die down, and it's in the key demographic of 25 to 54-year-olds. And as you said, however, the sort of low cost of production, effectively just having like 4 people talking to each other, meant it was a real profit generator for NBC. So the question now is, like, who would replace him? And there are lots of names floating around, but as you mentioned, the Winter Olympics was something that he was going to be heavily involved in, and that was like a very important property for NBC, but that could be an opportunity for them to roll out a new lineup.
Let's talk about the ratings and the revenue here. I mean, are we expecting an actual impact in the numbers?
Well, it's interesting because Matt Lauer is not as popular as he once was. He once had a very strong sort of recognizability amongst viewers, and he was there was a number of, it was like 11% of TV watchers said he was their favorite TV personality. But he hasn't been as popular recently, especially as morning TV competes with a lot of other platforms providing content now. So maybe that's weakened, and NBC is going to have to contend with finding someone to replace him. Maybe that makes it a bit easier. But he has always been a sort of polarizing character anyway.
The other morning show, CBS this morning, also reeling after Charlie Rose was fired, also for sexual misconduct and similar allegations. How do you think this will shake up the morning show scene in general? Now you have two shows essentially reeling with their main star gone.
It's really a fascinating time in TV. I mean, we've already seen on the cable news side with what's happened at Fox News, where Bill O'Reilly, their biggest star, got kicked out because of misconduct and allegations that they still deny, but they had to change their whole lineup. Now Fox News hasn't really found, I think, the same footing that they had with O'Reilly. Some nights they've done as well, but that's still a sort of #1 leader in cable news. The Charlie Rose show, it's interesting because the initial numbers show that numbers have come off a bit, but it's probably too early to tell. But it is going to provide an opportunity for potentially bringing new, fresher faces to the network, to the networks, and it's going to be interesting to see if they're going to be able to find the talent. From sometimes when I've spoken to agents, they've said that there's, not that easy, especially to find, people that they're stars. That's obviously they're hard to come by.
All right. Bloomberg has ended its production and distribution arrangement with Charlie Rose. Of course, we're going to be closely following this story, looking at the replacement talks, which are sure to come shortly. Anusha Sakui for Bloomberg in LA. Thanks so much, Anusha. Now, to another story we continue to watch, reports about the culture at Google and a history of inter-office relations that have been a focal point of frustration for employees. We're joined by Bloomberg Tech's Alistair Barr, and still with us, Techonomy CEO and guest host for the hour, David Kirkpatrick. Both of you have covered Google for many years. So, Alistair, I'll start with you. We had new revelations out earlier this week about Andy Rubin and him leaving after having an inappropriate relationship. Now we have another bigger picture story about how inter-office relationships have been a long-time trend at Google, which isn't necessarily new to many of us, but in this climate, it's really hitting home. Tell us what we know now.
So yeah, there's a story that was written in the Information by a former colleague of mine, Reed, and he basically reported a long history of some top Google executives in relationships, consensual relationships, but often relationships with subordinates, and these were often not reported. Some of them came out in the media a few years ago, and the general effect on other employees at Google was that they thought that it wasn't as much of a meritocracy as maybe outwardly Google looks, and it caused a lot of concern for women. Some women, for example, who did well by just doing very, very well, but they were spending a lot of time with male executives, and in one example they were teased, and it was implied that they kind of got time with executives because they were good looking and things like that.
David, many of these relationships were well known. They've been reported about. A relationship between Larry Page and Marissa Mayer in the early days. Sergey Brin's relationship with Amanda Rosenberg on the Google Glass team. The Information reported a new relationship with David Drummond, the chief legal counsel, and one of his subordinates, essentially. What do you make of how? Do you think this is problematic? And if so, how problematic?
Well, I think that it seems problematic for Google, and at least the article in the Information also pointed out that the company is making a very determined effort to change its policies, to enforce its rules much more methodically. But I think all of us, as you know, as you mentioned yourself, who've covered this company have observed some of these things in the past, and we are in a different moment now. And I think the entire industry is moving towards more awareness of what is proper and what isn't, and to try to really come up with rules and policies that prevent men in particular from abusing their power over women. But I also think it is worth noting something that some former Google employees mentioned in that information article, which is really that Google is probably more than any other big company, the most effective machine for producing extremely talented and effective women leaders of tech. So that is a weird possible sort of tautology or contradiction, but even as we can see they've had problems with these power relations and potential abuse, they also have generated an extraordinary number of very, very talented women technology leaders.
Right. I've talked to many current and former Google employees who have very divergent views about how Google treats women. Some of them think that this is the best place they've ever worked, and some of them think it's you know, it can be sexist, it can be misogynistic. Alistair, what do you make of the way they've handled things more recently, you know, with Andy Rubin and Amit Singhal, who also left for harassment allegations? But again, these are very recent situations where they were allowed to leave quietly. Actually,
one thing I want to make a point on what we were just talking about. There was a quote in that story which I thought was pretty depressing, where one of the former Googlers said her time there, she experienced bad things while she was there, but less bad things than other tech companies she'd been at, which is just awful. Right. But yeah, moving on to Rubin and Amit Singhal, I think maybe Google's approach to this type of thing changed maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I think Rubin being asked to leave and Amit Singhal being asked to leave is an example of that, where they're a bit tougher. The problem with it is that they allowed them to go, and in Andy Rubin's case, Google gave him, I think it was $100 million for his new startup. Amit Singhal got a great job at Uber. Yeah, so I think they still have work to do.
All right, Alistair Barr, Bloomberg News, thanks so much. David Kirkpatrick of Techonomy, you are sticking with me. Well, much more coming up. And remember, Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV, weekdays, 5 p.m. In New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Elisa Parenti in Washington, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word news. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders is defending President Trump's retweet of videos posted by extreme far-right UK group Britain First.
I think what he's done is elevate the conversation to talk about a real issue and a real threat. That's extreme violence and extreme terrorism, something that we know to be very real and something the president feels strongly about talking about and bringing up and making sure is an issue every single day.
UK lawmakers are urging Theresa May's government to formally cancel the state visit invitation extended to President Trump because of the retweet and another tweet from Trump lashing out at May for criticizing him. May was the first world leader to visit the Trump White House. Now the U.S. has delayed the Trump trip because of concerns about the scale of potential protests. The Saudi energy minister says the kingdom's output capacity remains relatively normal. Khalid Al-Falih spoke to Bloomberg after the OPEC conference in Vienna.
There is no erosion to speak of. Manifa continues to be booked at 900,000. There is only one small trunk line for water injection, and it's in the process of being fixed. But our announced capacity of 12.5 is basically intact.
Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Elisa Parenti. This is Bloomberg. It's just after 5:30 p.m. here in New York, 6:30 Friday morning in Hong Kong. We are joined by Bloomberg's Sophie Kamarudin with a look at the markets. Well, Sophie, Dow 24K, it happened here in the States.
Yeah, it happened. We're hoping that Asia may take the cue and start December on an upbeat tone, especially given that tech rebound that we saw on Wall Street. So we might see a recovery from that Tencent-led sell-off that we saw on Thursday in Asia. Plus, we have a proverbial laundry list of eco data to watch in Asia. So futures in Japan pointing higher before the latest read on jobs, capex, and core inflation. Now, over in the currency space, we do have that strong U.S. GDP print helping keep the dollar on the the up there, while yen selling persists amid resurgent risk appetite. In Bitcoin, it's now ticking higher amid volatility intensifying. In oil, just barely higher there as enthusiasm wanes over OPEC agreeing to prolong output cuts till the end of 2018. In Hong Kong, I'm Sophie Kamrudin. Up next, more with Bloomberg Technology.
This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Both YouTube and Facebook are touting success erasing online extremist content. YouTube removing tens of thousands of sermons and lectures by al-Qaeda recruiter Anwar al-Awlaki. And Facebook says its AI tools are spotting 99% of Islamic State and al-Qaeda's content on their platform, something UK Prime Minister Theresa May welcomes.
We must also step up our efforts to crack down on terrorist use of the internet. Tech companies have made significant progress on this issue, and I welcome Facebook's recent announcement on the use of artificial intelligence to improve the detection of terrorist content and speed of its removal.
Joining us now from Washington, Tara Mahler, Senior Policy Advisor for the Counter-Extremism Project, and still with us in New York, my guest host for the Hour, Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick. So, Tara, first of all, explain the significance of some of the content removal that we've seen more recently.
Absolutely. I remember being here with you in the studio a couple of weeks ago after the tech hearings, and fortunately we've seen some progress. We're not all the way there yet, but the move by YouTube is actually pretty significant. It's something that my organization, Counter-Extremism Project, has been pushing them to do. We've been writing letters. We've been putting pressure on them. There's a New York Times op-ed today by our founder and CEO, Ambassador Mark Wallace, and Fran Townsend, President Bush's former Homeland Security advisor, pushing to get this content off their platforms, and they finally did it. So now when you search for these videos, the 80,000 Anwar al-Awlaki videos that were up there, an extremist jihadist cleric who has inspired and radicalized individuals all over the globe, those videos, which violate the terms of service, are no longer up there in most cases. Significant reduction. So we applaud that effort. Having said that, he's not the only individual. He's not the only terrorist. He's not the only problem happening on these platforms. So there still is work to be done, but we do applaud that move, and it's something we've been calling for a long time.
We do have a quote from that op-ed, Tara. They say, killing terrorists is only half the battle. A new focus on combating extremist and terrorist ideologies online through company policies, industry-wide standards, and technology will be paramount in keeping the public safe. How much more of this content is out there? How hard is it to spot? How quickly does it go up online?
Sure. So there's a lot of content out there that's generally problematic, but what we're talking about is the worst of the worst terrorist content, the worst extremist content. Individuals and organizations that are on the foreign terrorist organization list, for example, from the State Department. Individuals that are on the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions list. Individuals that you can't do financial transactions with, we don't think should have safe harbor or safe haven to operate on these platforms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's WordPress or smaller platforms. And there are solutions out there to get some of this content down, content which, in our opinion, violates the terms of service. They've made progress, so there have been steps that have been taken by each of the companies, but there's still a long road ahead because this problem keeps evolving, it keeps changing, and you need to stay on top of it. It's not an imaginary problem. We see across all of the cases of terrorism that occur, most of these homegrown cases here and the cases of cells in Europe, there's an online radicalization element. So it's something that we've been very focused on, and I think Capitol Hill's been very focused on it in light of the recent tech company hearings earlier this month.
It's certainly not an imaginary problem, and it's been a problem for a very long time. David, what do you make of the fact that they're doing this now when pushed, but it's been a long time coming?
Well, it's interesting considering that we've just come through a period, and possibly are still in a period, where the tech companies, Facebook and Google in particular, have been getting regularly hammered by politicians and the media for a variety of kind of antisocial projects that are taking advantage of their software. So it's a big change in tone when you have Theresa May saying something very flattering about Facebook and an op-ed from a group like Tara's in the New York Times praising Google and YouTube for taking down content. So this music to the ears of these companies. But there is so much more to do. And I'm excited to think that software can make a significant dent in this problem. But I get a little nervous about the general notion that the companies need to be the arbiters of what is allowed, because ultimately I don't know whether the society should trust for-profit corporations to decide what kind of speech is or is not tolerated.
And Tara, you know, I know you've done work on using AI to combat this problem, and Facebook is making progress there. Is AI really fully equipped to do this, or do humans need to be involved? So there are technological solutions out there. There are different ones. Our organization, the solution we have been pushing, it's actually not officially AI because it's not artificial intelligence based. It is a database technology solution, which means that they use this already. It was developed by Dr. Hani Farid at Dartmouth College. He's an advisor to our project. It's mentioned in the op-ed. And for child pornography, they basically run software that filters out a known database of images. So whatever you put in that database for child pornography, there's 30,000 images. Those images can never resurface. So you can imagine a similar system set up for terrorism, where you take the worst of the worst, you catalog it into a database, and the technology essentially filters it from ever resurfacing on the platform again. This can be done with Anwar al-Awlaki videos. This can be done with beheading videos. It can be done with audio, still imagery, and video as well. So that's one solution where you don't have to sort of have the debate over, you know, how smart is the AI? Is it going to make mistakes? In this case, it's just a human identifies the problematic content, you archive it, and then that content can't resurface. It can't, you know, perpetuate indefinitely online. So that's what we've been pushing for. It seems the tech companies are starting to look at different technology solutions. One of the main issues here is there's not been as much transparency as we'd liked. It's sort of the blueprint or the framework for the approach here. You're exactly right, David, that, you know, these companies aren't national security experts or terrorism experts per se, and that's fine, but we might need to have, you know, an independent arbiter that sort of houses the database of this, or that makes decisions with the tech companies about what belongs in there. And that's sort of how the model works on child pornography. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children houses that, and those are the images that are basically filtered off of these platforms. So we've proposed an analogous model where there would be sort of a database that could do that. And I will just add one other point. You said that it was pressure from the Hill, pressure from the media, and, you know, pressure from organizations like us, but also advertisers who started pulling their ads off YouTube because they were running in front of problematic content. At the end of the day, they're companies. So it is a really good case study how sort of multi-factors of sort of directional pressure from a variety of sources can make an impact. And I think we're going to need to keep pressing at it for more.
Look, Tara, David here. Does your group believe that government ought to essentially push for or legislate the creation of the kind of body you just described? Or is this something you think could and should emerge simply from industry activism? I mean, I'm frankly skeptical about the latter, but what do you think?
Sure. So right now they've already come together and sort of built a collaborative effort between the tech companies. So we like that idea. I think you're right. There might need to be, we're not pushing per se for a specific legislative solution, although you've seen on other issues now, the recent sex trafficking bill, and also, which the tech companies are now, you know, on board with, and also the Honest Ads Act about ad buying on these platforms. It might take some regulation on the margins here, or at least even reporting or some best practices to get them to act. Having said that, to date, there hasn't yet been legislation, and we've seen progress. So I think we can put the pressure on them, but there may be legislative solutions out there. We haven't pushed for a specific congressional piece of legislation on this. There isn't one out there right now.
All right, Tara Mahler, lots of work to do, and good work that you're doing, Senior Policy Advisor for the Counter-Extremism Project. Thanks so much for joining us. David Kirkpatrick, my guest host for the hour. You are sticking with us. All right, well, a change at the top of the C-suite for Blue Apron. The online meal delivery business has appointed Brad Dickerson as its new CEO and president. He replaces Matt Salzberg at the top. Dickerson has served as CFO since joining the company in February of last year. Blue Apron's stock price has been struggling since going public in June, its share price losing nearly 70% of its value. Meantime, Alphabet has nabbed one of Intel's top former execs to help run its cloud business. Diane Bryant, the most well-known and successful female executive in the $300 billion chip industry, is heading to Google. Until May of this year, she led Intel's market-dominating data center business. Intel will pay Bryan a $4.5 million separation fee and expects her to agree to some restrictions on information use and recruiting of Intel employees. Coming up, the Bloomberg 50 is out now. Find out who made the cut in big tech and who didn't. We look at the people who shaped the business world in 2017. Next, this is Bloomberg. Elon Musk wants to bring his ultra-rapid Hyperloop transit system to the Windy City. The city of Chicago has put out a call for an express route to cut the time and cost to travel between O'Hare International Airport and downtown Chicago. In response to the request, Musk tweeted, "The Boring Company will compete to fund, build, and operate a high-speed loop connecting Chicago O'Hare Airport to downtown." Well, the Bloomberg 50 is out. From finance to politics to entertainment and, of course, tech. Bloomberg Business Week is highlighting the people who have defined global business in 2017. This is the 7th year of the Bloomberg 50 and the 2nd year it has appeared in Bloomberg Business Week. Our Bloomberg Business Week editor, Megan Murphy, joins us now to tell us who made the cut in tech. So, Megan, who made the cut in tech?
Well, someone you've just been talking about there. Elon Musk made the cut in tech. Obviously, the Boring Company is getting a lot of attention. At being from Chicago, I'm personally thrilled to hear about that transit link between O'Hare and the city. But look, when you look at what he did this year in terms of both in the rocket space as well as in the driverless autonomous vehicle space, he was a clear choice for us. And he's someone who, even when we tried to make a list where you get rid of the usual suspects, he still stands out. Another someone who we thought about as the usual suspect, but definitely made the cut this year, Jeff Bezos, of course, Amazon, the Washington Post, and now potentially the total reinvention of the food and the grocery market with that stunning move into Whole Foods in that space. I think we're all watching to see what shakes out there. Just two of the people who stand out from tech as well.
Other tech notables, Masayoshi Son, founder of SoftBank, making big moves, trying to negotiate a big stake in Uber as we speak. Diane Greene, Senior Vice President and Cloud Chief at Google. David, what do you make of these picks?
I think they're great picks. I think it's maybe the first list of this type I've seen in a long time that didn't include Mark Zuckerberg on it. That's got to be controversial. I'd be curious what Megan has to say about why they left him off.
So that's a very good point. And when we were compiling this, I want to be really clear about what we want is true. And when we want to get into this space, we want to say, okay, we don't want this to just be the people who you read about every year. And I think Mark Zuckerberg could have been a possible candidate this year simply because for what Facebook didn't do in putting in safeguards in terms of you look at the safeguard of the democratic process, what they've done in investigating. Who we do have on the flip side of Mark Zuckerberg is actually Russian botnets and looking into what they've done in terms of driving the conversation in 2017. Mark Zuckerberg does make our usual suspects list, but in terms of who really influenced and drove the conversation in 2017, we looked at, Russia's influence potentially on our democratic process and the democratic process elsewhere as well. Masayoshi Son, I'm really glad you brought that up. As you guys talk about all the time, we're incredibly fascinated to see where he goes. Obviously, the Uber stake is one big thing, but also where else is this money going to go? Is it the sign of an ultimate bubble, or is this just money that is going to be driving the trends, the innovations, the AI of tomorrow, where he's going to go with that? And the particular thing I want to pick out about him, the photography in this issue and really capturing him, I think it's one of the best spreads on him I've ever seen.
Curious about the Diane Greene pick. Obviously, she's the co-founder of VMware. She's running Google's cloud business, which, has actually, some thought struggled for a long time. It is gaining ground, but AWS is really the giant in the room. Why Diane?
Well, you've also been discussing just earlier about another Diane coming on as well now from Intel. When we looked at this list, we wanted to pick out some of the people who, as I said, are driving sort of the next iteration of these companies, and tech is no different than finance. And we feel Diane, in terms of cloud and what they're doing and the ambitions of that business and its coreness in terms of where we're moving, not only in the next year, but in the next 10 years, that she's really at the forefront of that. And she's someone who, and this was a big aspiration of this list, if you don't know who these people are now, you should. And she's one of the names that we think really was at the top of that category of people of you should know this person, and they are driving the conversation. They're driving the way you live, the way your business works in ways that you don't even know about right now.
Indeed. You should know Diane Green. I agree, Megan. David, final thoughts. Obviously, this is the kind of list these things shift every year, but our effort here is to bring it forward and look at what's happening next and who will be driving those future business transformations.
Yeah, well, there's some great names on there, like Bobby Kotick of Activision, who's one of my favorite people in the industry, and his company. It's in gaming. It somehow doesn't get mentioned as often as I think it deserves to be mentioned. He is a great leader. He's built the company, grown it tremendously. Its stock has been performing fantastically. I was really pleased to see him get some credit. I agree. Musk, everything Musk does is all about climate change in the end. And I find that fascinating, and I think he deserves a lot of plaudits for that. Regardless of the valuation issues or whatever, he's a unique, superb leader in society. And Diane Green, too. There's somebody I've been following for many, many years, and she doesn't get much attention at all. And she is one of the major definers of the world we're living in right now. So it's a great list. I got to credit you guys, Megan. Terrific.
Thank you so much.
Well, yes.
It's great to hear. I'm Bobby. Anyone who's been playing games since we have knows how influential Activision has been, and we're thrilled to include him.
Exactly. If you've been playing games for a few decades, Bobby Kotick has touched your life. Okay, Megan Murphy, Bloomberg Business Week editor, thanks so much for bringing us that list. David Kirkpatrick, you are sticking with me. All right, coming up, Alexa is heading to the office. Amazon's plans to have Echo voice technology incorporated into the workplace. This is Bloomberg. Instagram has reached another milestone. More than 25 million businesses have accounts on the social network. And now keep in mind, it was only in July that it had 15 million of those profiles. There are over 200 million daily active users who view at least one business profile every day. And Amazon's Alexa technology could be coming to a workplace near you. The company announced its voice-activated tools will handle common office tasks. Alexa for Business will let users issue voice commands to begin a video conference or print documents, among a multitude of other common functions. This is only the latest in the company's efforts to make its Echo technology ubiquitous in users' lives. Still with us, David Kirkpatrick, CEO of Techonomy, and our guest host today. So, David, what do you make of Alexa moving into the workplace?
Well, first of all, let us acknowledge Amazon's extraordinary ambition and continuing ability to execute in more places than we could possibly imagine. That said, I think this makes perfect sense. It's almost inevitable. The biggest battle in tech, possibly, going forward between all the big giants is over intelligent assistants that are generally going to be voice controlled. Alexa is the one that more or less initially defined the category, but we have Siri, of course, Microsoft Cortana, Facebook is supposedly working on something, and I'm sure we'll come out with that soon. The idea that these would not go into the office is crazy, because if this is the primary form of competition between these giants, they've got to go to ubiquity. The faster they can get these kinds of systems into all of society, the more any individual company that does that is going to get an advantage. So, and as somebody who works in a WeWork, which is one of Amazon's partners in deploying this idea, I welcome it tremendously. I think it could be great to control the printer, which is one thing they mentioned. It makes sense to have Alexa pretty much everywhere we go.
Is Amazon staking out new territory here? Do you think this is a place where Apple and Google will try to follow, as they have with smart speakers in general? Oh,
absolutely. I think Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and others, Apple, of course, will be working in the workplace as well as in our personal lives, on our phones, in our watches, to get this technology in our cars, pretty much everywhere. But the workplace, like I said, is a very logical place for it to go. I do credit Amazon, again, though, with getting there first and getting this story first. I mean, they just keep defining this space and making everyone else follow them, which is supremely impressive.
Indeed, right on the heels of breaking into the physical grocery business, it certainly seems like Amazon, more than any of these other big tech companies at the moment, is willing to define new territory for itself rather than follow others.
Just unbounded ambition, and ambition in so many different directions, and yet successful execution, as I said at the beginning, in so many areas. It really, my daughter actually asked me, do you think Amazon is the best managed company in the world? And I said, well, it's definitely a contender. I mean, it's impressive.
Impressive indeed. All right, David Kirkpatrick, we'll be watching to see if they can pull it off. It's a lot of new territory to try to enter at once. Our Bloomberg Television contributing editor and CEO of Techonomy. Always great, David, to have you here on the show with us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. On Friday, VMware CEO Pat Gelsinger will be joining us to talk about the software firm's earnings results. This is Bloomberg.